she was forgotten in an orphanage for 23 years, until the Duke revealed the truth of her father London, 1826. Afternoon light crept through the cracked windows of Mercy Home Orphanage when Carol B. Miles heard her name spoken with a certainty that should not exist. Not by the matron, not by the children whose night terrors she soothed, but by a voice that belonged to corridors of marble and power, not halls of peeling plaster and perpetual cold. Carol B. Miles. The syllables cut through 23 years of careful silence like a blade through worn linen. At 23, she knew which floorboards betrayed footsteps, which shadows offered the safest refuge from cruel hands, which identical grey mornings would stretch into identical grey evenings. But she had never heard her surname, given by a matron too weary for imagination, spoken as though it connected her to something real, to someone, to a history that existed before the orphanage walls swallowed her whole. She stood frozen on the third-floor landing, her fingers gripping the banister until her knuckles whitened. Through the window, the prosperous neighbourhoods of London sprawled in the distance, worlds populated by people who belonged somewhere, whose births were celebrated rather than concealed, whose fathers claimed them. Carol had never belonged anywhere. She was merely the woman who mended the linens, the shadow who served breakfast but never sat for it, useful enough to keep, forgettable enough to ignore. The matron's footsteps echoed below, heavier than usual, quicker. She appeared at the base of the staircase without her customary expression of practiced indifference. In her hands, she clutched a leather-bound document, and on her finger, impossible gleaming, rested a silver signet ring bearing a crest Carol had never seen, but somehow recognized as wealth, as lineage, as everything this building was built to deny. "There is a gentleman in the receiving parlour," the matron said, and her voice carried something Carol had never heard directed at her before. Deference. "The Duke of Ashford. He's asking for you." Carol's breath stopped. A duke. For her. Her heart struck once against her ribs, hard, accusatory, as if she'd committed some unforgivable transgression. Then it seemed to halt entirely, suspended in the thick silence of boiled cabbage and broken promises, because dukes did not journey to forgotten corners of London by accident. And no one searched for a woman who'd spent 2 decades perfecting the art of not existing unless there was a reason that would shatter everything she thought she understood about herself. If you love stories where forgotten women reclaim their destinies, where scandal becomes strength, and where love demands we see ourselves as worthy, stay with Carol's journey. Your presence here matters, and I'd love to know, where in the world are you reading from? These stories of transformation travel further than we imagine. Carol B. Miles did not know who her father was. She knew only what the orphanage ledger recorded. Female infant, abandoned February 1803, mother unknown, surname assigned by administration. No note, no promise of return. No name that might connect her to the world beyond these walls. She grew up among discarded children and exhausted caretakers, learning to read from donated primers, to sew from scraps too worn for resale, to survive on the charity of women who fulfilled their Christian duty without ever meeting the eyes of the girls they claimed to rescue. At 16, she became an assistant. By 20, the unofficial guardian of younger children. She had no dowry, no prospects, no confirmation that her birth had registered as significant to anyone, anywhere. Her only inheritance was the knowledge of how to be invisible, how not to want, how not to expect, how not to take up space that wasn't freely given. Carol descended the narrow staircase with measured steps, her pulse beating a rhythm foreign to Mercy Home's practiced stillness. This wasn't hope. Hope was a luxury for women with futures. This was something else entirely, recognition, perhaps, or reckoning. The door to the receiving parlor stood slightly ajar. She stepped inside. The man stood near the soot-stained hearth, tall and immovable, as though the shabby room itself had been forced to acknowledge his presence. He appeared to be in his early 30s, dark hair swept back with aristocratic precision, grey eyes sharp enough to inventory every threadbare corner, and her. He wore an impeccable charcoal coat and held leather gloves in one hand, as if he'd arrived from a world where orphanages existed only as charitable footnotes, never as lived reality. He studied her for a moment that stretched too long, taking in her patched dress, her work-roughened hands, her carefully neutral expression. Then he spoke. "Miss Miles, your father has left you everything he couldn't give you in life." The words fell into the room like a verdict already rendered, like a door opening onto a landscape she'd never been permitted to imagine. Carol's legs refused her command to sit, so she remained standing as the Duke of Ashford opened the leather portfolio with movements too precise to be anything but rehearsed. Inside lay documents that smelled of expensive paper and legal ink, things that had never touched her world before. "Your mother's name was Elizabeth Miles," he began, and Carol's breath caught because she'd never had even that much. "She was employed as a housemaid at Bradford Hall in Hertfordshire. She was 19 years old when Viscount Henry Bradford Miles took notice of her. Took notice." The words were carefully chosen, aristocratically neutral, but Carol understood what they concealed. Her mother had been young and powerless, working in a house where her refusal would have cost her employment, her reputation, everything. The Viscount had not needed to force her. His position had done that work long before he'd ever spoken her name. When Elizabeth discovered she was carrying his child, the Viscount arranged for her removal from the estate. He provided a sum of money. Fred's jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in his composed delivery. £50 to be precise. She was sent to London with instructions never to contact him or make any claim on his name. She died 3 weeks after giving birth to you. Childbed fever. The room tilted slightly. Carol pressed her palm against the wall, feeling the familiar damp plaster beneath her fingers, anchoring herself to something real while her entire past rewrote itself in her mind. Her mother had been a person with a name, with youth, with a life that had been systematically dismantled. And her father. "Viscount Miles knew about me." Her voice emerged steadier than she'd expected. "He knew I existed." "Yes." Fred met her eyes directly, and she saw something like anger there, though whether at her or the dead Viscount, she couldn't determine. "He knew. The orphanage received an anonymous payment each year for your care. Minimal, enough to ensure you weren't turned out, not enough to provide you with any real opportunity. He monitored your existence from a distance, Miss Miles, but he never acknowledged you. Not once in 23 years did he visit, write, or publicly claim you as his daughter." Carol felt something sharp and cold settling behind her ribs where softer emotions might have lived in a different woman. Her father had known she existed and had chosen to keep her confined here, visible enough to ease his conscience, invisible enough to protect his reputation. He'd paid for her survival, but not her life. He'd ensured she wouldn't starve, but never considered she might deserve more than mere survival. "He died 6 weeks ago," Fred continued. "And in his final days, conscience or cowardice compelled him to alter his will. You are his only surviving child, Miss Miles. He's left you everything, his estate, his properties, his fortune, all of it belongs to you now. Everything he couldn't give her in life. Everything except the one thing she'd needed most, a father who claimed her while he still drew breath." Fred watched Carol Miles absorb the truth of her inheritance with a stillness that unnerved him more than tears would have. She stood against the orphanage wall as though she'd been painted there, her expression carefully empty, her hands no longer trembling. 23 years in this place had taught her how to disappear even while remaining visible, and he found himself both impressed and disturbed by the skill. He'd made a promise to a dying man, and he was discovering that some promises carried consequences he hadn't adequately considered. Viscount Miles had summoned him 6 weeks ago, his breath rattling in his chest, his famous charm reduced to desperate, wheezed confessions. "There's a girl," he'd said, and Fred had known immediately what kind of girl he meant, the kind wealthy men created and discarded, the kind whose existence became an inconvenient footnote. "At Mercy Home Orphanage. Carol. She's mine, Walker. My daughter." The word had emerged with something between shame and defiance. "I've left her everything, but she'll need protection. Society will devour her if she's alone. You'll serve as her guardian, 2 years or until she marries. You'll teach her what she needs to know. Keep her safe from fortune hunters and worse. Promise me." Fred had promised, because refusing a dying man's final request seemed unconscionable, because he'd believed it would be a simple matter of financial stewardship and minimal social interference. He had not anticipated the intelligence in Carol's eyes when she'd first looked at him, the way she'd processed devastating information without collapsing into hysterics or gratitude. He had not anticipated that she would be beautiful in an understated way that would make his sister's circle view her as a threat rather than a curiosity. Most troublingly, he had not anticipated his own complicated response to her. Society would call Carol tainted, illegitimate, base-born, the living evidence of an aristocrat's moral failing. The fact that her father had been a viscount wouldn't elevate her. It would only make her scandal more visible, more delicious for those who fed on others' misfortune. She would be invited to events specifically so she could be courted by men who viewed her inheritance as compensation for her bloodline, whispered about in drawing rooms where her presence would serve as cautionary tale and entertainment combined. Fred's responsibility was to navigate her through those treacherous waters without allowing his own reputation to suffer irrevocable damage. His responsibility was to fulfill the letter of the Viscount's will while maintaining appropriate distance. His responsibility was certainly not to feel protective anger on behalf of a woman he'd met less than an hour ago, nor to wonder what kind of mind had developed behind those carefully guarded eyes during 2 decades of systematic neglect. "Miss Miles," he said, more gently than he'd intended, "you have a choice before you. You can refuse this inheritance and remain here, or you can accept it and everything that acceptance entails, including my guardianship, society's judgment, and a life you cannot possibly imagine yet. I need your answer." She turned toward him fully then, and he saw something fierce kindle behind her composure. "I accept." Ashford Manor rose from the Hertfordshire countryside like something from an illustration Carol had once seen in a donated book, all honey-coloured stone, mullioned windows, and manicured gardens that spoke of generations of wealth so secure it never needed to announce itself. The carriage rounded the circular drive, and Carol felt the orphanage falling away behind her with each rotation of the wheels, though she suspected its marks on her would prove more permanent than geography. Fred's housekeeper, Mrs. Daventry, received her with the practiced courtesy of a woman who knew precisely what Carol was and had decided to reserve judgment. The bedroom prepared for her contained more space than the entire dormitory she'd left behind. Carol stood at the window that night, watching moonlight silver the grounds, and wondered if a person could die from the shock of suddenly mattering. The education began the following morning in the library, a room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that smelled of beeswax and old paper. Fred sat across from her at a table scattered with ledgers, contracts, and documents bearing her father's seal, his expression unreadable as he explained the fundamentals of estate management. "Your annual income from the properties is £1,500, he said, sliding a detailed accounting ledger toward her. "This represents rents from tenant farms, timber rights, and investments in the funds. You'll need to understand how these revenues are generated and maintained." Carol studied the columns of figures, her finger tracing the careful notations. Numbers had always made sense to her in ways people rarely did. They followed rules, behaved predictably, revealed truths when properly interrogated. Within minutes, she'd identified an inconsistency in the quarterly rents. "This tenant's payment decreased by 12% over 2 years, she said, tapping the entry. "But the notation says the acreage hasn't changed. Either the land's productivity has declined, which should be investigated, or the rent was incorrectly recorded initially and needs correction." Fred's eyebrows rose fractionally, the first genuine surprise she'd seen crack his aristocratic composure. "That's precisely the issue the estate manager flagged last month. It took him 3 reviews to notice it." Something warm unfurled in Carol's chest. Not pride exactly, but recognition, the same feeling she'd experienced at 12 when she'd realized she could read faster than the orphanage teacher, that her mind worked differently, that invisibility had given her the space to develop capabilities no one expected from a forgotten girl. The days acquired a rhythm, mornings in the library dissecting contracts and legal documents, afternoons reviewing property surveys and tenant agreements, evenings where Fred tested her understanding with increasingly complex scenarios. Carol discovered she possessed an instinct for strategy, for seeing 3 moves ahead in negotiations, for understanding the unspoken motivations beneath formal language. She also discovered that Fred watched her with an intensity that had nothing to do with guardianship and everything to do with something neither of them could afford to acknowledge. "You're a remarkably quick study, Miss Miles," he said one afternoon, and his tone carried something that might have been respect, if respect were permissible between them. Carol met his eyes steadily. "I had 23 years of being underestimated, Your Grace. I don't intend to waste this opportunity proving everyone right." Fred's sister arrived at Ashford Manor unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, sweeping into the drawing room with the particular energy of someone who'd come specifically to disapprove. Lady Catherine Blackwood had opinions about propriety the way some people had opinions about weather, constant, vociferous, and entirely resistant to contradiction. "So, this is the orphan," Catherine said, her gaze raking over Carol with the thoroughness of a jeweler assessing a questionable stone. She didn't bother lowering her voice. "I suppose she's presentable enough, though that dress is hopelessly provincial. You'll need to hire a proper modiste, Frederick, unless you intend to parade her about looking like someone's charity project." Fred watched Carol's expression remain perfectly neutral, though he'd spent enough hours observing her across the library table to recognize the slight tightening at the corners of her mouth. She understood she was being discussed as an object requiring improvement rather than a person deserving courtesy, and she was choosing her response with the same strategic calculation she applied to contract negotiations. "Lady Blackwood," Carol said, her tone measured and clear, "I appreciate your concern for my appearance, though I confess I'm more interested in ensuring my understanding of entailment law is adequate than in achieving fashionable perfection. Perhaps you might recommend a solicitor as readily as you recommend a dressmaker." Catherine's face colored. She wasn't accustomed to women who responded to condescension with polite defiance, who refused to apologize for their existence or grovel for acceptance. "How extraordinary," she said, the word dripping with implications, and turned to Fred. "She certainly has opinions for someone in her position." "Her position," Fred heard himself say, his voice harder than he'd intended, "is that of a woman of considerable property and independent means. Miss Miles's opinions on her own education seem not only relevant but necessary." The shocked silence that followed was worth whatever social discomfort would result. Catherine stared at him as though he'd suddenly begun speaking in tongues. and Carol's eyes met his with something that looked dangerously close to gratitude mixed with understanding, the kind of understanding that existed between equals rather than guardian and ward. That evening, after Catherine had departed in a flurry of offended dignity, Fred found himself standing at the library window, watching Carol walk through the garden below. She moved with increasing confidence through spaces that would have intimidated most women of her background, her posture straight, her steps deliberate. She was learning to inhabit her inheritance, not as an imposter, but as someone discovering she'd always had the right to occupy such spaces. The realization struck him with uncomfortable force. He was no longer thinking of Carol Miles as an obligation to be discharged or a promise to be fulfilled. He was thinking of her as someone whose intelligence challenged him, whose dignity humbled him, whose presence had become the most compelling part of his carefully ordered days. This was dangerous. This was impossible. This was precisely what he'd promised himself wouldn't happen. And yet, here he stood, watching her examine rose bushes with the same focused attention she brought to financial ledgers, and feeling respect transform into something far more complicated. The library had become their world within a world, a space where the rules governing guardian and ward seemed to dissolve into something more fundamental. Two minds engaged in conversation that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with genuine fascination. Carol arrived each morning to find Fred already there, having selected documents he thought would interest her. Not merely instruct, she'd noticed, but genuinely interest. Complex legal puzzles, philosophical treatises on property rights, correspondence from his own estate managers that revealed the intricate dance between aristocratic authority and practical governance. He was teaching her not how to be managed, but how to manage, and the distinction was everything. "The Married Women's Property Act is being debated again in Parliament," Fred said one morning, sliding a newspaper across the table. "What's your view on it?" Carol scanned the article, her pulse quickening at the implications. "That any law requiring a woman to surrender her property and legal identity upon marriage is fundamentally unjust," she said. "Though I imagine many would argue I'm uniquely positioned to feel strongly about such things given my circumstances." "Your circumstances," Fred replied, leaning back in his chair with an expression she'd learned meant he was genuinely considering her words. "Give you perspective that comfortable people lack. That doesn't make your view less valid, it makes it more necessary." These were the moments that undid her, when he treated her thoughts not as charming novelties from an unusual specimen, but as contributions worth incorporating into his own understanding. When he argued with her, not to diminish her, but to sharpen both their thinking. When the distance between Duke and illegitimate ward collapsed entirely, leaving only two people who'd discovered something rare, intellectual equality that sparked into something warmer. She'd caught him watching her sometimes when he thought her attention was on documents, his expression unguarded in ways it never was in company. And she knew her own face betrayed too much during their debates, when passion overtook caution and she forgot to protect herself from wanting things that women like her had no right to claim. "You're smiling," Fred observed one afternoon, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to surprise even him. Carol looked up from a particularly satisfying contract negotiation she'd just worked through. "I've discovered I have a mind that works, Your Grace. That seems worth smiling about." "Fred." The word emerged quietly, almost carefully. "When we're here, you might call me Fred." The intimacy of it struck her like a physical touch. Names carried weight in their world, the difference between formal distance and something achingly personal. She should refuse, should maintain the boundaries that protected them both from impossible complications. Instead, she heard herself say, "Fred, then, and you should call me Carol." His eyes held hers for a moment too long, and she saw in them the same dangerous recognition she felt, that what was growing between them in these morning hours had exceeded the terms of any guardianship, had become its own force with its own logic. "Carol," he said, testing her name in his voice, and it sounded like a beginning neither of them could take back. The dinner at Hartwell House was Carol's introduction to the machinery of exclusion that operated beneath polished manners and crystal chandeliers. Lady Pemberton had extended the invitation with the kind of smile that promised entertainment at someone else's expense, and Fred had accepted because refusal would only delay the inevitable gauntlet Carol would need to walk. She descended the staircase at Ashford Manor in a gown of deep emerald silk that Mrs. Daventry had commissioned. Elegant, without being ostentatious, expensive enough to command respect, but not so lavish as to invite accusations of overreach. Fred waited at the bottom, and something flickered across his face when he saw her that had nothing to do with guardianship, and everything to do with a man seeing a woman he wanted to protect and possess in equal measure. "You look formidable," he said quietly, as he handed her into the carriage. "I feel terrified," she admitted, then caught herself. "I shouldn't have said that. You should always say that. To me." His hand tightened briefly over hers before propriety demanded he release it. The Pemberton drawing-room glittered with the local gentry, minor baronets and their wives, a viscount's widow, several daughters being paraded for advantageous matches. Conversation faltered when Carol entered, a rupture in the social fabric quickly papered over with exaggerated politeness that was somehow worse than open hostility. Lady Pemberton performed introductions with surgical precision, her emphasis on Miss Miles rather than any familial connection serving as a delicate reminder of Carol's irregularity. The other women assessed her with the thoroughness of generals surveying enemy fortifications, her dress, her posture, her carefully neutral expression, searching for weaknesses to exploit. "How fascinating that you've come to us from such humble origins," Mrs. Hartwick said over the soup course, her tone suggesting fascination was the last thing she felt. "You must find our world terribly overwhelming." Carol met her gaze steadily. "I find that people are much the same regardless of their circumstances, Mrs. Hartwick. We all want security, recognition, and to matter to someone. The primary difference seems to be that some of us are more honest about those desires than others." A shocked silence rippled outward. One didn't speak uncomfortable truths at dinner parties, didn't suggest that aristocratic pretensions might be exactly that, pretensions. Fred's expression remained carefully neutral, but Carol saw approval flash in his eyes. "And what do you know of our world's complexities?" Lady Catherine interjected, having apparently coordinated her attendance specifically for this ambush. "Estate management, tenant relations, the responsibilities that come with property?" "I know," Carol said, her voice calm and clear, "that the Ashford estate's timber revenues increased 18% this quarter, due to renegotiated contracts with London merchants. I know that 3 tenant farms require drainage improvements that will cost initially but increase productivity substantially. I know precisely what I've inherited and exactly what it requires of me." The silence that followed was different. Respect reluctantly granted, the recognition that Carol Miles would not be easily dismissed or destroyed, that she'd arrived at their table prepared to fight for her place with weapons they hadn't expected her to possess. Bradford Hall stood abandoned in the Hertfordshire countryside, its windows dark and gardens overtaken by wild growth that spoke of years without proper care. Viscount Miles had died without direct heirs willing to claim the estate, leaving it to pass to the daughter he'd spent 2 decades pretending didn't exist. Carol stepped from the carriage and stared at the house that should have been her childhood home, feeling nothing but a cold, hollow anger that surprised her with its intensity. "We don't have to go inside," Fred said beside her, reading her hesitation with the accuracy that had become habitual between them. Yes, we do. Carol moved toward the entrance with deliberate steps. I need to see what he valued more than me. The interior smelled of dust and neglect, furniture covered in Holland cloth like corpses awaiting burial. Fred had brought the estate inventory, and they moved through rooms cataloguing what now belonged to her. A library filled with books she'd never been allowed to read, a nursery that had remained empty despite her existence, drawing rooms designed for elegant entertaining that had never included his illegitimate daughter among the guests. In the study, Carol found her father's desk still scattered with papers, as if he'd simply stood and walked away from his life. She rifled through correspondence, legal documents, household accounts, and then, tucked in a locked drawer that Fred helped her pry open, she found them. Reports from Mercy Home Orphanage, dated annually, describing a girl's progress in perfunctory terms. Carol Miles, age 7, adequate health, learns quickly, causes no disturbances. Carol Miles, age 14, assists with younger children, shows aptitude for figures. He'd known. Every year, he'd received confirmation that she lived, learned, existed. And every year, he'd filed the reports away and continued his life as though she didn't matter enough to disrupt his comfortable arrangements. He tracked me like livestock, Carol said, her voice shaking with fury she'd kept carefully contained for weeks. Made sure his investment didn't die, but never once considered that I might deserve more than survival. That I might want a father instead of an anonymous benefactor who paid the minimum required to ease his guilty conscience. Fred stood behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence like heat. Money can't compensate for what he withheld from you. The inheritance is substantial, Carol, but it's not justice. It's not love. It's just his final attempt to transform abandonment into something that looks like providence. She turned to face him, and the grief she'd held at bay since learning her father's identity finally cracked through her composure. Why wasn't I worth claiming while he lived? What was so shameful about me that he couldn't acknowledge me even once? Fred's hand came up to her cheek, a gesture so tender it nearly undid her completely. Nothing. There was nothing shameful about you. The shame was entirely his. Carol. And he spent his whole life proving himself a coward. She leaned into his touch, letting herself want something she had no right to claim. This man's regard, his protection, his heart. Carol's 25th birthday arrived with the autumn rain, and with it came the end of Fred's legal guardianship. The solicitors had already prepared the documents transferring full control of her inheritance, no longer requiring his signature or approval for any decision she made. She would be, in the eyes of the law, entirely autonomous, a woman of property and independent means, beholden to no one. She should have felt liberated. Instead, she felt the approaching freedom like a severance, cutting away the one connection that had given her life shape and meaning these past months. Fred had been careful lately, painfully so. He'd stopped using her given name in company, maintained proper distance during their library sessions, avoided any gesture that might be construed as inappropriate affection. He was preparing to release her, fulfilling his promise to her father, with the same honorable precision he applied to everything. And Carol was discovering that honor could be its own form of cruelty. She found him in the library on the morning of her birthday, standing at the window with the rain-streaked glass framing his silhouette. He turned when she entered, and the expression on his face was carefully neutral. The Duke of Ashford, rather than Fred, the man who'd touched her cheek at Bradford Hall, and looked at her as though she mattered beyond obligation. "Happy birthday, Carol," he said, and even her name sounded formal, distant. "The papers are ready for your signature. You're free." Free. The word hung between them like an accusation. She crossed the room slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs with the same force it had the day he'd first arrived at Mercy Home. She'd learned so much since then, about estate management, about her own capabilities, about navigating a world designed to exclude her. But she'd also learned something more dangerous, what it felt like to be seen completely, valued genuinely, to discover that intellectual partnership could transform into something that felt dangerously close to love. "What if I don't want to be free?" The words emerged before caution could stop them. "What if I want to choose something else entirely?" Fred's composure cracked just slightly. "Carol, you deserve more than a marriage born from guardianship obligations and social convenience. You deserve someone who chooses you without the weight of promises made to dying men, without society questioning whether I'm fulfilling duty or following desire." "Then let me be clear," Carol said, closing the distance between them with the same courage she'd summoned at Lady Pemberton's dinner table. "I'm not asking you to fulfill anything. I'm not grateful for rescue or protection. I don't need a guardian anymore, Fred. But I find I very much want a partner, someone who challenges my thinking, who respects my capabilities, who sees me as an equal rather than an obligation finally discharged." She watched understanding dawn across his face, watched the careful control he'd maintained for months begin to fracture. "I fell in love with you somewhere between contract negotiations and property surveys," he admitted, his voice rough. "And I've been terrified it was the one thing I had no right to feel." "You have every right," Carol said, "and so do I." They married in the Ashford Manor Chapel on a cold November morning, with only Mrs. Daventry and the vicar as witnesses, because the marriage itself mattered more than society's performance of approval. Carol wore cream silk and carried no flowers, and when Fred slipped the ring onto her finger, she felt the weight of it not as possession, but as partnership. Two people choosing each other with clear eyes and unguarded hearts. The scandal, of course, was immediate and delicious. A duke marrying his illegitimate ward mere weeks after her guardianship ended provided fodder for drawing-room speculation for months. Lady Catherine cut off all communication, convinced her brother had been seduced by a scheming orphan. The invitations they received came from curiosity rather than acceptance, but Carol had long since stopped measuring her worth by other people's approval. What mattered was the work. 6 months after the wedding, Carol stood once again at the entrance of Mercy Home Orphanage, but this time she arrived in her own carriage with legal documents that would transform the building from a repository of forgotten children into something purposeful. The Miles Foundation, funded by her inheritance and managed with the same strategic precision she'd brought to estate accounting, would provide education, legal advocacy, and genuine opportunities for illegitimate children across England. The matron who'd once assigned Carol her surname now stood before her with an expression caught between suspicion and desperate hope. "Your Grace," she said, the title still strange attached to the woman who'd once scrubbed these floors. "Mrs. Hollis," Carol replied evenly. "I'm here to discuss changes." The orphanage would be rebuilt, not torn down and replaced, but fundamentally restructured. Proper heating, adequate nutrition, qualified teachers, rather than overwhelmed caretakers. Most importantly, a system ensuring each child knew their own story, whatever it was, rather than growing up as Carol had, a person without history, without context, without the basic dignity of knowing where they'd come from. Fred stood beside her as she explained the Foundation's vision to the assembled staff, his presence a steady support rather than a dominating force. He'd learned to stand beside rather than in front, had discovered that loving a formidable woman meant celebrating rather than diminishing her capabilities. No child should be erased because of circumstances they didn't choose, Carol told the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd claimed her own worth against impossible odds. And no amount of money can compensate for abandonment, but it can ensure that abandonment doesn't define an entire life. That evening, as they drove back to Ashford Manor through the winter darkness, Fred took her hand. "Your father left you everything he couldn't give you in life," he said quietly. "But you've transformed it into something he never imagined, not inheritance as compensation, but inheritance as revolution." Carol leaned against his shoulder, feeling the weight of her past finally settle into purpose rather than pain. She'd been forgotten for 23 years, but she would spend the rest of her life ensuring no other child experienced the particular cruelty of systematic erasure. The inheritance was reborn, and so was she.